Labor, Copper, and Resistance. The Rise of Zambia's African Worker Movements, 1930s-1950s. Before Zambia became an independent nation in 1964, it was known as Northern Rhodesia, a British colony defined largely by its immense copper wealth. From the 1930s through the 1950s, the Copperbelt region, rich in minerals and heavily industrialized, became not only the economic engine of the colony but also the birthplace of African labor resistance and political consciousness. This period of strikes, protests, and union organizing marked a turning point in Zambia's history. It sowed the seeds of nationalism and laid the foundation for the country's future independence movement. The Copperbelt, backbone of colonial industry. The discovery and exploitation of vast copper reserves in northern Zambia during the early 20th century drew significant investment from British and South African companies. By the 1930s, towns like Ndola, Kitwe, and Mufulira had developed into bustling mining hubs, housing thousands of African workers employed under harsh and racially segregated conditions. African miners were paid wages far lower than their white counterparts, lived in poorly constructed housing, and were denied upward mobility or formal union representation. As demand for copper surged globally, especially during World War II, the colonial government and private mining corporations increasingly depended on cheap African labor to sustain profits. The 1935 Copperbelt Strike. The first major expression of African resistance came in 1935, when miners protested a new tax and deteriorating conditions. Though the strike began peacefully, it quickly escalated. British authorities responded with force, and police opened fire, killing at least 6 African workers. This marked a watershed moment in Zambian labor history. It was the first organized protest against colonial authority in Northern Rhodesia and signaled the emergence of African workers as political actors rather than mere laborers. Wartime and post-war tensions. World War II, 1939-1945, brought intensified copper production and heightened exploitation. While profits soared for foreign companies, African miners continued to suffer, leading to mounting frustrations. After the war, a more politically aware workforce emerged, influenced by global calls for decolonization and equality. In 1940, another large-scale strike erupted, leading to more clashes and deaths. Yet, despite repression, African workers increasingly organized themselves into trade unions, laying the groundwork for larger movements. The birth of African trade unionism. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, African miners began forming formal labor unions, such as the African Mineworkers Union, AMU. These organizations demanded better wages, improved working conditions, representation in management and labor negotiations, an end to racial discrimination in employment. The AMU's rise was significant not just for labor rights, but also for politics. Many future independence leaders, including Kenneth Kaunda, emerged from or were closely aligned with labor activism. Link to nationalist movements. The Copperbelt labor struggle helped spark a broader national consciousness. Unions became rallying points for political mobilization, and mine workers, who were often educated and well-organized, formed the backbone of Zambia's nationalist movement. As the 1950s progressed, workers increasingly saw the fight for better conditions as inseparable from the fight for self-governance and decolonization. The United National Independence Party, UNIP, and other nationalist organizations drew heavily from the labor movement, structure, and energy. Legacy of the Copperbelt struggles. The African labor movement in the Copperbelt was more than a series of strikes. It was a training ground for political leadership, a platform for mass mobilization, and a proving ground for African demands for dignity and sovereignty. By the time Zambia gained independence in 1964, its workers were not only more organized, they were politically awakened, ready to shape the nation's post-colonial future. Conclusion. The labor struggles in Zambia's Copperbelt region during the 1930s-1950s were among the most important pre-independence movements in southern Africa. They represent a powerful chapter in African resistance history, one in which ordinary workers transformed their economic fight into a political revolution, paving the way for national liberation.